Story 1. Somewhere in Florida, there is a field where children are buried without names, no headstones, no flowers, no dates, just small wooden crosses rotting in the dirt, and behind each one, a mother who never got an answer, a father who never got a phone call, a family who was told their boy ran away, or got sick, or simply disappeared, and was expected to move on and never ask questions again. This is not a ghost story. This is not fiction. This happened. This was allowed to happen. And for over 100 years, the state of Florida looked the other way while boys, some as young as 6 years old, walked through the gates of the Dozier School for boys and never walked back out. Before we go any further, my name is Mubarok, and I run this channel, Lunar Lore, because stories like this one deserve to be told by real people, not algorithms. What you are about to hear is one of the most disturbing true stories in American history. It is a story about children who were failed by every system that was supposed to protect them. It is a story about families who spent decades searching for the truth. And it is a story about a small white building on a piece of land in the Florida Panhandle that boys called the White House, not because it was grand or beautiful, but because it was the last place many of them were ever seen alive. So settle in, turn up your volume, and please do not skip ahead, because the most disturbing details in this story are not at the beginning. They are buried deeper. Just like the boys, it starts as most American tragedies do, with good intentions and bad execution. The year is 1900. Florida is still a rough, underdeveloped state with growing cities, dirt roads, and a population that is struggling to define what civilization looks like in the Deep South. State legislators, inspired by a national movement to reform troubled youth rather than imprison them, vote to establish the Florida State Reform School on 400 acres of land just west of Tallahassee, near the small panhandle town of Marianna. The idea is simple on paper. Boys who break the law, boys who are homeless, boys who are considered incorrigible or unmanageable, instead of being thrown into adult prisons, they will be sent to this school. They will be educated. They will learn trades. They will be disciplined and corrected. And eventually they will return to society as productive members. That was the promise. That was what was written in the proposal. That was what the legislators told themselves when they voted yes. But from nearly the very beginning, the reality of the Florida State Reform School looked nothing like that promise. From nearly the very beginning, boys were suffering behind those gates in ways that would not be fully understood by the outside world for another 100 years. Think about the families who sent their boys there. Think about what they were told. Think about a mother in 1935, sitting in a small wooden house somewhere in rural Florida, watching a county official load her 13-year-old son into the back of a car. Maybe her boy had been caught stealing food. Maybe he had been skipping school. Maybe he had been running away from a home that was not safe. And the state had decided that made him a problem to be corrected rather than a child to be helped. She watches the car drive away. She tells herself it will be okay. She tells herself he will come back in a few months, maybe a year, a little older, a little wiser, ready to make something of himself. She goes back inside and she waits. She waits for a letter that does not come. She waits for news that never arrives. and then one day, weeks later, maybe months later, she gets a knock on the door. A school official is standing there with his hat in his hands, and he tells her something happened. Her boy got sick. Her boy ran away, and they could not find him. Her boy had an accident. The details vary depending on who is telling the story and what year it is, but the result is always the same. Her son is not coming home, and there will be no body to bury because they are not entirely sure where he is. This happened not once, not twice. By the time researchers finally began digging through the records in the early 2000s, they found evidence that at least 81 boys had died at the Dozier School for boys over the course of its operation. 81 children, and the records of where most of them were buried had simply vanished. Now let us go back further. Let us go back to 1961, because that is the year that Jerry Cooper arrived at the school, and Jerry Cooper's story is one that will stay with you long after this video ends. Jerry is 16 years old in 1961. He is not a bad kid. He is a teenager doing what confused, unhappy teenagers sometimes do. Running away from home, hitchhiking across the state, looking for something he cannot even name. He gets picked up one day by a Marine who turns out to be Abe O.L., driving a stolen car. The police pull them over. Jerry is in the passenger seat. He does not own the car. He did not steal the car. But he is 16. He has been running away. He is the kind of kid that judges in 1961 Florida do not give the benefit of the doubt to. The county judge charges him with car theft and sends him to the Florida School for Boys in Marianna. That is what the Dozier School was called back then. The Florida School for Boys. A name that sounds almost wholesome. A name that tells you nothing about what actually waits inside those gates. Jerry arrives and he looks around. He sees other boys, some his age, some younger. Some of them are there because they committed actual crimes. Some of them, Jerry will later learn, are there for something as minor as smoking a cigarette at school or being what adults in that era called incorrigible, which often just meant a child who talked back or did not do what they were told. And some of them, this is the part that gets to Jerry, some of them are orphans. Boys with no families, no advocates, no one to call if something goes wrong. Boys who were sent to Marianna simply because no one knew what else to do with them. Boys who were delivered into the hands of this institution with no one on the outside even checking to see if they were okay. Jerry does his best to keep his head down. He does his best to follow the rules and stay invisible and survive his sentence without incident. But after a few weeks, the other boys start warning him. They warn him about the White House. It is a small, concrete building on the school grounds, painted white, set slightly apart from the dormitories and classrooms. The boys speak about it in whispers. They do not linger near it. They do not make eye contact when they pass it, because they all know what happens inside, and they all know that the sound that comes out of those walls at night is not something you forget. Jerry learns about the White House firsthand at 2 o'clock in the morning. He is asleep in his dormitory when 2 members of the school staff appear beside his bed and tell him to get up. They do not explain why. They do not tell him what he did wrong. They walk him across the dark grounds toward that small white building, and when they open the door, Jerry sees what the boys had been warning him about. Inside, there is a room with a bed against the wall and a large industrial fan running loudly in the corner, loud enough to drown out whatever sounds might come from inside. And hanging on the wall, there is a leather strap, about 3 feet long, thick, heavy. The boys have a name for it. They call it the Black Beauty. The staff members do not speak to Jerry. They throw him face down on the bed, they tie his feet, and then the beating begins. The first blow lifts Jerry's body a foot and a half off the mattress. That is not an exaggeration. That is what he will tell investigators decades later, his voice still carrying the weight of something that never fully healed. He says he could hear the shuffle of their shoes on the concrete floor as they swung, the sliding sound of rubber soles against stone, and then the impact. Over and over. He passed out at some point. He does not know how far in. When he woke up, he was back in the dormitory. A boy in the room next to the White House would later tell Jerry that he had counted the lashes. 135. 130. 5 blows with a leather strap, administered in the middle of the night, to a 16-year-old boy who had not even committed the crime he was sent there for. This was not unusual at the Dozier School. This was not an isolated incident carried out by one rogue employee. This was the system. This was how the school operated. And it had been operating this way for decades before Jerry Cooper ever walked through those gates. And it would continue operating this way for decades after he left. Now here is where the story gets deeper. Here is where it stops being about individual suffering and starts being about something more sinister. The machinery of silence that allowed this to continue. Think about what it takes to run a place like this for over 100 years. Think about how many people have to know and say nothing. Not just the men who administered the beatings, but the administrators who signed off on the policies, the state officials who received the reports and filed them away, the judges who kept sending boys to a school they must have heard rumors about, the politicians who funded the institution year after year without ever demanding a serious investigation. The silence at Dozier was not accidental. It was institutional. It was deliberate. And it was maintained, in part, by making sure that the boys who suffered there had no credible voice. Because here is the thing about who ended up at the Dozier School. The children sent to Marianna were, by and large, children that society had already decided to stop protecting. Poor children. Children from broken homes. Children whose parents had no political connections, no money for lawyers, no platform from which to make noise. Black children, particularly in the earlier decades of the school's operation, were housed in a completely separate section of the grounds under conditions that were even more brutal than what the white boys experienced, in a state and an era where racial segregation was not just accepted but enforced by law. Black boys at Dozier had even less recourse, even fewer people willing to listen, even smaller chances of anyone outside those gates ever caring what happened to them. And the boys who survived and left, what happened to them? They went home carrying wounds that could not be seen. They went home with nightmares and flashbacks and a bone. Deep shame that many of them could not explain even to themselves, because the culture of that era did not give men, especially men who had been labeled as troubled youth, the language or the permission to say that they were hurt, that they were damaged, that something had been done to them that should never have been done. Many of them said nothing for 30, 40, 50 years. They buried it. They drank to silence it. They had nightmares they could not tell their wives about. They flinched at sounds that reminded them of shuffling shoes on concrete floors. And the families who sent boys there and never got them back, they were left with something even harder to carry. Because at least the survivors knew what had happened to them. The families of the boys who died at Dozier were left with nothing but official explanations that never quite added up. Stories that changed depending on who was telling them, and a grief that had no proper burial site to anchor it. Take the story of Thomas Varnado. Thomas is 13 years old in 1934 when he is sent to the Florida State Reform School. His nephew, Glenn Varnado, will spend decades trying to find out what happened to him. The family was told Thomas died of a disease. The details were vague. The paperwork was incomplete. Thomas was buried somewhere on the school grounds, or so the family assumed. But no one could tell them exactly where. No one could show them a grave. No one could give them a marker to put flowers on, a place to stand, and say goodbye. Glenn Varnado grows up hearing his family talk about Thomas in the way families talk about the dead who left too soon and under circumstances no one fully understands. There is grief there, yes, but there is also something else. A low, persistent unease. A feeling that the story they were told does not cover everything that actually happened. Glenn carries that feeling into adulthood, into middle age, and when, in the 1990s, he visits the school, which was still operating at the time, and asks a staff member to show him where his uncle is buried. What he is shown sends that unease crashing into something much darker. The staff member takes Glenn Varnado, not to the main cemetery on the school grounds, but to a second location, a different area, half hidden, poorly maintained. And the staff member tells him, almost casually, as if this is simply a fact and not a confession, that this is where they think the 5 boys who died in a fire in 1914 might be buried, and that Thomas Varnado, his 13-year-old uncle who died in 1934, might be buried there too. Might be. They are not sure. Might be. They are not sure about a child, about a 13-year-old boy whose family has been waiting 80 years for an answer. Glenn Varnado does not walk away from that moment and let it go. Glenn Varnado walks away from that moment and decides that he is going to find his uncle. Whatever it takes, for however long it takes. But before we follow Glenn's fight forward to its conclusion, we need to go back again. Back to the 1950s and 1960s. Back to the era when the White House Boys were being made. Because that is when the horror at Dozier reached what many survivors describe as its peak. By the 1950s, the school has been operating for half a century. It has been through multiple investigations, multiple reform efforts, multiple rounds of public outrage, followed by bureaucratic promises, followed by nothing changing. Boys are still being sent to Marianna for crimes as minor as smoking in school. The demographics of who ends up there have shifted somewhat over the decades, but the fundamental character of the place has not. And the White House? That small concrete building with its industrial fan and its leather strap continues to be the dark center of the institution's disciplinary philosophy. Roger Kaiser is one of the boys who passes through Dozier in the late 1950s. Roger is not there for a crime. Roger is there because the state of Florida has decided that the system knows better than families what to do with certain children, and the system has placed Roger in its machinery and sent him to Marianna. Roger is the kind of boy who notices everything, who watches and remembers and stores details with the precision of someone who already understands, at a young age, that no one is going to believe him unless he can back up every word. Roger Kaiser will later write about what he witnessed at the school. He will describe not just what was done to him, but what he saw done to others. He will describe a boy he watched die in a bathtub. He says the boy had been beaten so severely that he looked like he had been mauled by dogs. Roger did not know at the time whether the boy had been running away and been caught by the school's dogs, or whether the injuries were from something else entirely. He never found out the truth about that particular boy. He will also describe something even more disturbing. A boy, he says, he saw come out of one of the school's large industrial dryers, not alive. These are not the kinds of details that people invent. These are not the kinds of memories that form themselves out of nothing and attach themselves to a specific time and place and institution. When investigators and researchers later interview the White House boys, they find a consistency across dozens of testimonies from men who had not spoken to each other in decades. A consistency of detail, of setting, of method, of specific, grinding horror that makes denial increasingly difficult to sustain. And the state of Florida did try to sustain it. For a long time, when Florida's governor at the time, Charlie Crist, ordered a state investigation into the abuse allegations in the late 2000s, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement interviewed both survivors and former staff. Their conclusion was damning in what it did not say. They could not find enough evidence, they said, to support the allegations. They could not find evidence that any staff member was responsible for any student deaths. Roger Kaiser's response to that conclusion was measured but devastating. He said, it all came down to civil liability. He said the state did not want anyone to have factual evidence that would force them to pay for what he considered to be crimes. And when you look at the timeline, at how long the school operated, at how many investigations went nowhere, at how many reports were filed and forgotten, it is very difficult to argue with that interpretation. Because here is what the investigators could not explain away. Even according to the state's own records, 81 boys died at the Dozier School over the course of its operation. State records identified 31 former students whose remains were interred in the school cemetery. That left 50 other boys, 50 children, whose deaths were documented but whose burial locations were simply listed as unknown. Unknown in official state records about children. And that is before you get to the ground, penetrating radar. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers from the University of South Florida arrived at the Dozier School grounds with equipment that does not lie. Forensic anthropologist Erin Kimmel led the team. She had become interested in the case after hearing the testimonies of the White House boys, and she brought to it the same methodical, evidence-based approach that she had applied to mass grave investigations in other parts of the world, because that is what this was, a mass grave investigation in the United States, on the grounds of a state-operated school for children. Archaeologist Richard Estabrook pushed the ground-penetrating radar equipment across the area near the school's cemetery like a farmer working a field. The radar sends signals down into the earth and reads what it finds. And what it finds are disturbances, the classic shapes of grave shafts, the disruptions in soil density that mark the places where the earth was opened and then closed again around something, around someone who was placed inside. The official cemetery had 31 crosses. The radar found 49 grave sites in that area and the surrounding land, 49. And some of those sites, Kimmel noted, appeared to contain more than one person. Let that settle for a moment. The official record said 31. The ground said 49. And some of those graves held more than one body. Kimmel raised a question during the investigation that cut straight to the heart of what made this place different from every other state institution of its era. She pointed out that when you look at other state facilities from the same period, hospitals, prisons, other institutions, there are meticulous records, careful maps, plat documents that show exactly where every person is buried, documents that a family member today could look at and say, here is where my great-aunt was laid to rest. Here is the exact location. Here is the date. No such records existed for the Dozier School Cemetery. No plat maps. No location guides. No documentation of who was buried where or when or under what circumstances. Kimmel said she did not know why that documentation did not exist. But she said it stood out. It stood out very clearly. In an era when every other state institution managed to keep careful burial records, the Florida School for Boys, the institution that had the most deaths, the most questions, the most grieving families looking for answers, had somehow failed to keep any. There are things that happen by accident, and there are things that happen on purpose, and then there are things that happen because an institution has decided, collectively, unconsciously, systematically, that the people who might come looking deserve no answers at all. Now we come back to Glenn Varnado, because Glenn has not given up. After his visit to the school in the 1990s, after being shown that second, half-hidden cemetery and told that his Uncle Thomas might be somewhere in there, or somewhere else, or no one really knows, Glenn spends years pressing the state for answers. He writes letters. He makes calls. He attends meetings. He tells the story of his 13-year-old uncle to anyone who will listen, in the hope that someone in a position of authority will decide that a child's remains deserve to be found. The state resists for months, even as the University of South Florida research team is trying to gain access to the full grounds of the Dozier School. The state blocks them. There are portions of the property that are up for sale, land that some of the White House boys and researchers believe may contain additional burial sites, and the state is moving forward with that sale. moving forward with selling land that may contain the remains of children who were never given proper graves, whose families were never given answers, whose deaths were officially recorded, but whose bodies were officially lost. Glenn Varnado goes to court. He secures a temporary injunction that halts the property sale, and with that injunction in place, he forces the state into a position where it can no longer simply run out the clock and wait for the old men and the grieving families to stop asking questions. The state, backed into a corner, finally agrees to allow Kimmel and her team access to the rest of the school grounds. What they find over the course of their investigation is a landscape of loss far deeper than the official records had ever acknowledged. The research team identifies grave sites beyond the known cemetery. They find evidence of a second burial area. The location that Glenn had been told about, the area near the fire victims from 1914, and the other boys whose bodies were placed in the ground and then forgotten about or deliberately left off the maps. The work is slow, it is meticulous. Identifying remains and connecting them to specific individuals requires DNA analysis, requires family members willing to provide samples, requires the kind of patient, careful, deeply respectful scientific work that the institution itself never bothered to perform when these boys were dying on its grounds. But it moves forward, and for Glenn Varnado, moving forward is everything. Because there is a specific thing Glenn Varnado wants. He does not want money. He does not want a government apology delivered in the bloodless language of official statements. What Glenn Varnado wants is to bring his Uncle Thomas home. He wants to find whatever remains exist of a 13-year-old boy who died in 1934 in a state institution far from his family, who was buried in an unmarked or poorly marked grave, who was given no ceremony and no dignity and no record. And he wants to carry those remains back to his family's graveyard, where Thomas Varnado can finally rest among the people who loved him. That is not an extraordinary request. That is, in fact, the most ordinary thing in the world. A family wanting to bury their dead, a nephew wanting to honor his uncle, a human being wanting another human being to be treated, even in death, with the basic dignity that was denied to him in life. It takes years. It takes court filings and scientific investigation and the slow grinding work of forcing a state government to acknowledge what happened on its property. But it happens. Eventually, it happens. And while Glenn Varnado's fight is the story's most personal thread, it is not the only thread. Because there are hundreds of men who are still alive. Hundreds of men who walked out of the Dozier School and spent their adult lives carrying what happened to them in silence. Men who are now in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Men who are running out of time. Who understand that if they do not speak now, the story will be buried with them. Roger Kaiser is one of the first to go public with his experiences. He writes about the school, publishes his account, and begins to connect with other survivors. What starts as a handful of men comparing notes becomes, over time, a formal group. They call themselves the White House Boys. A name that takes the very symbol of their worst trauma and claims it, turns it into something they own, rather than something that was done to them. There are over 300 members in the group at its peak. 300 men who were children at the Dozier School and who have, in the later years of their lives, finally found each other. When they begin speaking publicly, the consistency of their accounts is impossible to dismiss. Not just the broad strokes, the beatings, the White House, the leather strap, but the specific details. The sound of the fan running to mask the screams, the way the staff members would brace their feet against the floor before each blow, the particular texture of the concrete walls, the smell of the room, the sounds from the neighboring rooms, men who had not spoken to each other in decades, who had no reason to be telling the same story, unless it was true, told the same story, and the stories went beyond beatings. The White House boys testified to sexual abuse, to boys being used for labor under conditions that amounted to slavery, to punishments so severe that boys were left bedridden for days afterward, to deaths that were explained as runaways or accidents or illnesses, deaths that the survivors believed were something else entirely, deaths they witnessed or heard about in the hours and days immediately after they occurred, before the school's internal machinery could shape the official narrative. One of the most disturbing patterns that emerged from the survivors' testimonies was the randomness of the punishment. Boys described never knowing when they might be taken to the White House or why. The criteria were unclear and inconsistent. A boy might be beaten for a perceived infraction so minor that he could not even identify it, or he might be beaten for no reason at all that he could determine, simply because a staff member was in a particular mood, or because a boy's face reminded someone of something, or for no reason beyond the fact that he was there and powerless, and the system had given his keepers absolute authority over his body. This randomness was not accidental. It was, in the most chilling sense, strategic. When punishment is unpredictable, when you cannot identify the rules well enough to follow them, when safety is never guaranteed, no matter how carefully you behave, that is when real psychological control takes hold. The boys at Dozier could never feel safe. They could never relax. They were always waiting, always watching for signs, always aware that at any moment, in the middle of the night, someone could appear beside their bed, and what would follow would be the White House, and the leather strap, and the industrial fan running loud enough to drown out everything. That kind of sustained, unpredictable terror does not leave a person when they walk out the gate. It travels with them. It wires itself into the nervous system. It becomes the invisible architecture of the rest of their life. The reason they startle at unexpected sounds, the reason they cannot fully trust authority, the reason they wake up at 2 a.m. with their heart hammering, and the smell of that concrete room in their nostrils. Decades later, in a different bed, in a different state, in a life they have tried very hard to build into something better. The White House boys who came forward in the 2000s were not young men. They were old men. They were grandfathers and retired workers, and men who had spent 50 years trying to put this behind them and had never fully succeeded. They came forward because they were running out of time, and because the alternative, dying with this story untold, leaving behind no record, allowing the institution and the state to maintain their official silence forever, was no longer something they could accept. They came forward because they wanted the truth to outlast them. And the truth they brought forward was this: the Dozier School for boys was not a reform school that occasionally crossed a line. It was not a well-intentioned institution that suffered from a few bad employees. It was a machine. A systematic, deliberate, long-running machine for the abuse, exploitation, and in some cases the killing of children who had no one powerful enough to protect them. It operated for over 100 years. It was funded by the state of Florida. It was overseen by state officials. It processed thousands of boys through its gates. And at every level of its operation, at every moment of its history, people knew what was happening, and those people chose to let it continue. That is the horror that does not go away when the White House boys finish speaking. That is the horror that outlasts the testimonies and the investigations and the forensic reports. Not just that these things happened, but that they were allowed to happen for so long, to so many, by so many who could have stopped them and did not. The Dozier School for Boys officially closed in 2011. After more than a century of operation, it closed not because the state of Florida had a sudden moral awakening, but because the accumulated pressure of the White House boys' testimonies, the University of South Florida research, the media coverage, and the legal efforts of families like Glenn Varnado's had finally made maintaining the institution more trouble than it was worth. After it closed, the University of South Florida team continued their work on the grounds. They exhumed remains from the identified grave sites. They began the long process of DNA analysis and identification. The state of Florida, under continuing pressure, eventually issued an official apology. The kind of bloodless, carefully worded official apology that covers the minimum required by political decency without actually acknowledging the full scope of what was done or committing to meaningful accountability. The White House boys found that apology insufficient. Of course they did. An apology issued decades after the fact, by officials who had nothing personally to do with the abuse, delivered in the language of government statements rather than human remorse. That is not justice. That is the appearance of closure designed to end the conversation before the conversation reaches its most uncomfortable conclusions. What would justice look like for the White House boys? Several of them have said that they do not know, that they have thought about it for so long without a satisfying answer, that the question itself has become part of the weight they carry. Roger Kaiser has said that compensation from the state would at least constitute an official acknowledgement that crimes were committed, that the state, in using these words, would be creating a legal and historical record that the abuse was real and the responsibility was institutional, and the boys who suffered were not broken children who deserved what happened to them, but victims of a system that fed them in the most catastrophic way possible. That record matters, not just for the White House boys, though God knows they deserve it, but for the historical understanding of how institutions can become machinery for abuse when the people inside them are given unchecked power over those who cannot fight back, and when the people outside them decide that the children involved are not worth the discomfort of looking closely at what is happening. The Dozier School was not a unique institution. It was an extreme example of a category of institution that existed across the United States and across the world. Schools, reformatories, orphanages, asylums, programs, places where children and other vulnerable people were sent and forgotten about, where the mandate to manage and correct was allowed to become the mandate to control and punish, where the absence of oversight created the conditions for abuse to become systematic and sustained and invisible to the outside world. What made Dozier different? What made it stand out even in that grim category was the duration. Over a century. Over 100 years of boys passing through those gates and emerging damaged, or not emerging at all. Over 100 years of families waiting for answers that did not come. Over 100 years of official investigations that found nothing conclusive, nothing actionable, nothing that would require anyone to stop what they were doing. That does not happen by accident. That kind of sustained, century-long institutional horror requires sustained, century-long institutional silence. And that silence implicates not just the men who held the leather strap, but everyone who knew, or should have known, and chose the easier path of looking somewhere else. By the time you finish listening to this story, the Dozier School for Boys has been closed for over a decade. The buildings on the property have been deteriorating in the Florida heat and humidity, slowly being reclaimed by the same landscape that hid so many graves for so long. The University of South Florida team has made significant progress in identifying remains and returning them to families. Glenn Varnado has not given up on bringing his uncle Thomas home. And the White House boys, those 300 or so men who found each other in the last chapter of their lives and decided to use whatever child knew had left to make sure the world knew what happened to them. They continue to carry the story forward. They carry it in interviews and public testimonies, and the books they have written, and the websites they maintain, and the legal filings they have made, and the small, stubborn insistence with which they have refused, after 50 or 60 or 70 years, to let this story be forgotten. They were boys who were told they were broken, that they were less than, that they deserved whatever was done to them. They grew up in a world that gave them very little reason to believe otherwise. And then, late in life, they found each other, and they found their voices, and they used those voices to do the most powerful thing a survivor can do. They refused to let the truth stay buried. There is a field in Florida where children are buried without names. Some of them have been found now. Some of them have been identified and returned to the families who never stopped waiting. Some of them are still out there, still in the ground, still anonymous, still waiting for someone to look in exactly the right place. The White House boys are still looking. They have been looking their whole lives. And they will keep looking until they can look no longer, because after everything that was taken from them, their childhood, their sense of safety, their years of silence and suffering, this is the one thing they will not give up. The truth, the names, the record. Because somewhere in Florida, there is a mother who deserved an answer, and she never got one. and her grandson, and her great-grandson, and everyone who comes after her. They deserve to know that someone was looking. That someone refused to accept the official story. That someone stood in that field and read the ground and said, "No, there is more here than what you told us. There is more here than you want us to find." And there is. There always was. Now, before this video ends, I want to ask you something directly. Of all the details in this story, the beatings in the White House, the unmarked graves, the families who waited decades for answers, the state that looked the other way for over 100 years, which part disturbed you the most? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and conversations like these are how stories like this one stay alive and keep mattering. And if this story affected you, if it made you angry or sad, or if you think more people need to know that this happened on American soil, in a state-funded institution, to real children with real families, please share this video. Send it to someone who thinks they know American history. Send it to someone who needs to understand what institutional silence looks like and what it costs. Every share keeps this story in front of people who might otherwise never hear it. This is Mubarok, and this is Lunar Lore, where the stories that were meant to stay buried get told anyway. Stay with me. There is always more to uncover.